Mr Amitabh Kant, the G20 Sherpa from the Government of India's side, Yezdi Nagporewalla, CEO KPMG India, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you all with us and a very warm welcome in this session with India's G20 Sherpa, Mr Amitabh Kant. Mr Kant, it's a privilege to have you with us and many thanks for agreeing to do this session on India's presidency of G20. You are a friend of AIMA and it is always a pleasure to sit with you and discuss the most important issues facing the country and the world. As India hosts the G20 meeting and events this year, you have a central role in projecting India's leadership of this elite group, or to this elite group as well, which includes 2/3 of humanity and contributes 3/4 of the world's trade and 85% of the global economic output. You are heading the Sherpa track of the G20 consultation coordination, and you have a broad spread of developmental issues on your plate. You've done a fantastic job of making Indians feel proud of their opportunity to lead the world, and given your track record in organization and branding, it is quite certain that you will ensure that nobody ever forgets India's presidency of the G20. Today, we look forward to learning from you about India's initiatives and priorities. Thank you for joining us and a very warm welcome to you. Yes, thank you. Mr. Nagporewalla, it's a pleasure to have you with us and thank you for joining us in this session. A very warm welcome to you as well. Ladies and gentlemen, in this session, we will explore the impact of India's G20 presidency on the world, as well as its impact on India itself. We will look at the circumstances in which India's turn to host G20 has arrived and consider how India can turn things around and get the major powers to collaborate again. The February meeting of the G20 finance ministers and the central bank governors highlighted the challenges involved in leading the group at this juncture. Global economic leaders were prevented from stating their strategy to overcome the growth crisis because of the West's insistence on using the forum to corner Russia. The war in Ukraine may be a geopolitical compulsion for both Western Europe and Russia, but it is holding back discussion and decisions on more global and urgent issues of food and energy security, crushing national debts, poverty reduction, and climate change. I believe that India does not need to pick sides, and it has not done so as well. This is particularly important here for India's soft power, because it has been presented with an opportunity to engage with all the major countries of the world as a leader. India must use this opportunity to fulfill its aspirations of promoting its interests and driving the global agenda, as well as to show the world a new form of development, greener, more inclusive, and scalable. India's presidency of the G20 is also useful for pushing through infrastructure and urban development across our own country. The 50-odd cities that are hosting various G20 meetings and showcasing events are being spruced up, and the host states have an opportunity to build their own global brands. We are privileged to have Mr. Kant with us to tell us about the various facets and objectives of India's G20 presidency, and also to tell us about India's potential gains from hosting the G20 this year. It's my pleasure to invite Mr. Amitabh Kant, India's G20 Sherpa, to deliver his keynote address, post which I will ask Mr. Kant some questions, and if we have time, I would open it up to the audience to ask some questions as well. To you, Mr. Kant.
Distinguished guests, Mr. Sawhney, Mr. Yezdi Nagporewalla, very distinguished guests in the audience, my friend Kabir Bedi from my college, Sanjay Kirloskar, Rekha, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly delighted to be speaking before this very august gathering on India's G20 and its priorities. Ladies and gentlemen, G20 is important because we are in the midst of very major upheavals in the world. These are very turbulent times, actually. There is a geopolitical crisis in Europe, a war going on for over a year. But it's also important to understand that the world is facing a very severe recessionary trend. 1/3 of the world, according to IMF, is seeing a recession right now. 75 countries in the world are facing a severe global debt crisis. 75 countries in the world. There is a very major crisis, the post-COVID era, which is a crisis of 200 million people having gone below the poverty line. Almost 100 million people have lost their jobs. And then there is a crisis of climate action, that the earth may survive, but we as human beings will be extinct if we are not able to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050. And therefore, all of us have to believe in climate action. And then, on top of all this, there is a financial crisis with the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in the United States, and whether it will have cascading impact on other parts of the economy, because with inflation in USA and strengthening of interest rates, it has severe implications on emerging markets in terms of the wealth from emerging markets flowing back to the developed world. And therefore, in a globalized world, we are all interconnected. And G20 is important because it accounts for 85% of the global GDP, it accounts for about 78% of the global trade, it accounts for about 90% of the global patents. But more important than that, it accounts for about 2/3 of the humanity. And therefore, any decision taken by G20 has a severe implication on global economy. Now, G20 has grown and evolved as essentially an economic grouping, a grouping of finance ministers and the central bank governors to drive economic growth, prosperity, progress, and to ensure good financial management of the world. And every time there's been a crisis, whether it was 1919, whether it was 1999, or whether it was 2002 or 2008, whenever there's been a financial or a global economic growth crisis, G20 has stepped in and taken severe measures, and those have then got implemented through IMF, World Bank, and other implementing agencies. And therefore, G20 is critical. This is for the first time in the history of G20 that 4 successive presidencies of the G20 will be held by emerging markets. Starting with Indonesia last year, to India, then it goes to Brazil, and then it goes to South Africa. And therefore, if you look at the economy, the global economy, what you find is that from 1999 onwards, the share in the global output, the share of the global GDP, the component of the developed world is declining, and the share of the emerging markets is growing rapidly. And probably in another decade and a half, the emerging markets will have a much greater share of the global economy than the developed world. And therefore, when President Bush took it from the finance ministers and the central bank governors to creating a leaders summit, he was very clear that global crises like the one that happened in 2002 were all interrelated. An East Asian crisis will have an impact on global economy. Similarly, a Russian ruble crisis and a Mexican peso crisis will have a global impact all over the world. And therefore, the summit needs to be raised to the leaders' level. And since then, it has been held at the leaders' level. And G20, for a successful conduct of a G20, in the midst of a big war going on and all these crises going on, to my mind, there are 3 critical components which are important. The first is the political leadership and the political narrative that India builds up for the G20, and that is important because essentially it's a leaders' summit Prime Minister Modi is the leader for G20 during the course of the year. And therefore, the developmental perspective of India is critical, and I'll dwell on it a little bit. The second is the content, the priorities that India built up. What is India's priority? How does it want to drive the global economy? How does it want to drive the world in future? And that is important. And the third is, how well do we do the G20 presidency? How do we execute? Because we've also done the Commonwealth Games in the past. And how well do we execute it? And therefore, there are three components to it. The first and foremost is the political narrative that we are doing it in a lively, vibrant democracy. And in a lively, vibrant democracy like India, that you have an elected prime minister who's been elected the second time in an election and whose acceptance by the people still remains at a very high level of over 70%. And therefore, the political narrative is that you have a leader who's driving the global G20 leadership, who has very strong acceptance in a vibrant democracy. But I think more important than that is the development story that India has built up, that we are a young country which has a young demographics. Our average age is 29, and even as we go on to 2070, our average age will still be about 35. And that we've truly driven the digital transformation of India. That we are a country which has ensured a digital identity for every Indian. We've ensured that we open a bank account for every Indian, that we are able to link that bank account with Aadhaar, his digital identity, and the mobile number, and ensured that everybody can then use the mobile to make digital payments. And we do today 11x more payment than what the United States and Europe do together, and we do 4x more payment than what China does. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it's a remarkable story of digital transformation. It's also a story that we've used open source, open APIs, interoperable technology. Because if you look at the history of the world, in the last 2.5 decades, all technological development and innovation have been driven by the big tech. They've been driven by Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon in the West, and they've been driven by Tencent and Alibaba in China. But they've owned the citizens' data and used it for artificial intelligence, machine learning. India has built up, same model of United States was replicated in China. Europe took a different route, and they brought in a regulation called the GDPR, which ensured the privacy of data for citizens, but did it at huge compromise for innovation. And therefore, you've not seen much innovation emerging out of Europe in the last 2 decades. India took a very different approach, where it created the public platform, the railway track, on top of which we've allowed private sector to innovate and compete in the market space. So if you look at UPI, we've connected over 500 banks with each other, but we've allowed Paytm to compete with Google Pay. PhonePe competes with Amazon, with Apple, everyone in the marketplace, and there are 40 different companies competing as far as payments is concerned. And that has allowed a huge amount of innovation to take place. And what it has led to is an open source, open API model with the digital identity has ensured that a company like Jio, when it launched its mobile phone, was able to do acquisition of over 200 million people in 100 days. And the cost of acquisition of a customer, which was about $25 before, had shrunk down to $1. The cost of acquisition in Europe is still about $175 to $180. Why I'm saying this is that we've done innovation to population scale at low costs, and that's important. When I was a young officer in Kerala, one of my jobs was to transform the lives of traditional fishermen. And we were able then to give them outboard motors. They could go much further into the sea. We could give them new fiberglass crafts. We could give them new technology in terms of new fishing nets and introduce beach level auctioning. But fishermen were prone to drinking. And therefore, it was very important to open their bank account so they could save for a bad day when they will not get a catch. But opening a bank account was a nightmare. I used to chase bank managers, know your customers, and it used to take 8-9 months to open a bank account. The identity was a problem. Today we open a bank account in India using biometric in less than a minute. So I've seen this journey of transformation from 9 months to less than a minute in India. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, my belief is that the digital transformation that India has done has taken India, as the Bank of International Settlement has said, that during the COVID period, we were able to provide money into the bank accounts of 800 million people directly into the bank account without any leakages. And what the Bank of International Settlement said, that India has achieved in 7 years what it would have taken 50 years to achieve. In the normal course, what it would have taken 50 years, it achieved in 7 years. So that the transformational story of India is immense. Many of us do not realize it because we are seeing it on a day-to-day basis. The other important story is also to tell you the story of the transformation in terms of development, because India has been able to provide close to about 30 million houses. Now 30 million houses really means that we have provided a house to almost every single citizen of Australia. Every single citizen of Australia. It's also important to understand that we've been affordable houses. We've provided about 110 million toilets. 110 million toilets in India is like providing a toilet to every citizen of Germany. Every citizen of Germany. That's the population of Germany. We provided 243 million people piped water in the last 5 years. 243 million piped connection means that we provided water to every single person in Brazil. That's the size of Brazil. And we built 55,000 kilometers of road. That's like 1.5 times the diameter of the earth. That's the size and scale of transformation. And during the COVID period, we provided 2.2 billion people COVID vaccination, which is totally paperless and cashless. I mean, it was all digital. And therefore, the story of India in terms of the infrastructure built, road, houses, toilets, electricity connection, in terms of piped water, in terms of COVID vaccination is an amazing story. And therefore, my view is that this developmental perspective of India is to be highlighted very strongly during the G20 presidency, and that is the development narrative. The second key critical component to my mind is what are the priorities before the world? And what are India's priorities? So ladies and gentlemen, let me dwell on some of them. The first and foremost is that at a point of time when there is a global slowdown, it's very important to push for inclusive, resilient, and sustainable growth. Because without growth, you will not be able to transform lives of citizens across the world. And when leaders of the world meet, it's very important for them to look at the lives of citizens. And therefore, how do you achieve sustained growth on a long period of time to transform lives is very critical. And this is important because, as I said, we are midway between the 2030 goal of sustainable development goals. Instead of progressing, we have regressed. We've fallen back. The world has fallen back from what it had said, that it will transform lives of citizens through the sustainable development goals. Now, if the COVID has impacted lives, inflation has impacted life, the progress made in the last 20 years, the world had lifted people above the poverty line through free trade. That has, in the last 3 years, people have gone below the poverty line. And therefore, how do you accelerate the pace of growth is critical. And how do you build up a new action plan for sustainable development goals, which will enable you to actually accelerate the progress of growth. And this is very critical to our mind. The third very critical issue is that it's about climate action and climate finance. Because as we are all aware, the developed world, when they were industrialized, have carbonized the world. 88% of the total carbon space available, that is 2,800 gigatons of carbon space available at 1.5 degree centigrade, 2,400 gigatons has already been occupied by the developed world. India has occupied only 1.5 5% of the total carbon space available with 52 gigatons. Though logically, as per our population, we are entitled to about 17.5% of the total carbon space available. But irrespective of that, it's important to understand that we will, in due course, as we industrialize, the rest of the world has already urbanized, the rest of the world has already industrialized, our moment has just begun. And as we take this onward march for the next 3 decades of consistent rates of growth, and as we urbanize, as we industrialize, we'll become a major polluter. And therefore, India's challenge is to become the first country in the world to industrialize without carbonizing. And my belief is that it's important because the future belongs to those who digitize and those who go green. And countries and companies which go green will attract value and they will attract capital in due course. And therefore, it's very important that India adopts a very clean approach and a green growth approach. So the Prime Minister is committed to Panch Amrit at Glasgow, very ambitious goals. We've achieved our NDC targets committed at COP21 in Paris 9 years ahead of schedule. We do about 172 gigawatts of renewable energy, and we've now launched the Green Hydrogen Mission, which will ensure that we use renewable to crack water and produce green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is important because even if we do 100% renewable energy, there are hard to abate sectors, what are known as refineries, fertilizer, steel, cement, long distance transport. These all use fossil fuel. They cannot be transformed by renewable energy. Renewable energy, even if we do 100% electricity with renewable, that's only 20% of the energy. The balance 80% of the energy is all hard to abate sectors. And these sectors have to be decarbonized. And therefore, the future belongs to green hydrogen. India is climatically blessed. India's entrepreneurship is top class. We have the possibility of becoming the lowest cost producer, the lowest cost exporter in the world, and the world will head towards green hydrogen. The challenge is about availability of low cost financing. Our ability to get 30 years financing at low cost for climate finance is critical. There is no shortage of money in the world. The world is flushed with resources. The world is flushed with resources, but they are not able to find money into emerging markets because the risk profile of India is different. The interest rates in the United States are 1.5%. The interest rates in India are about 8%. The interest rates in Africa are about 15%. And in sub-Saharan regions, they are 22%. And therefore, Africa and sub-Saharan countries find it difficult to attract money. The challenge is how do we get 30 years financing in dollar terms at 1 or 2% with good hedging instruments. Now the challenge is that multilateral financial institutions like World Bank and IMF were made in the post-World War II era. They are creations of the Bretton Woods Agreement when there was no challenge of SDG, there was no challenge of climate action. And therefore, these institutions need to become institutions for supporting climate action and SDGs, and they need to ensure that private funds flow in, they are de-risked through new instruments like blended finance, like first loss guarantees and credit enhancement, and then you are able to get long-term financing. Once emerging markets get long-term financing, they will become the champions of climate action and climate change. Without that, Indian entrepreneurs will find it very difficult to do long-term financing. And therefore, India's fourth key priority is that there must be a huge transformation in the multilateral financial institutions which were made in the Bretton Woods period, and they need to become agents of greater credit flows to emerging markets, and this is important. That is the fourth priority. And the fifth priority is about digital transformation. It's about bringing right in front the digital public infrastructure that India has built up. We've done it not merely in fast payments, we've done it across COVID, we've done it through Diksha and Swayam, we've done it through FASTag, we've done it through DigiLocker, many areas. But it's important to understand that in the world today, there are 4 billion people without a digital identity. There are 2.5 billion people who do not even have a bank account. There are 133 countries in the world who do not have a digital fast payments. Now, India has been able to transform lives of citizens, become a more productively efficient economy because of digitization. And therefore, how do we take this model of India to the rest of the world is the challenge. And we'll use the G20 narrative to push this digital transformation story of India to the rest of the world and see how we can use this opportunity to transform the lives of citizens in the global south. And that is what is important. The last priority which the Prime Minister has put forth is about, for him it's very important, is about women-led development. That is important because today in India there are more women, which many of us are not aware. The new NFHS survey says that there are 1,022 women to 1,000 men. There are more women than men in India and actually around the world. And therefore, like in India and like in the rest of the world, it is not possible to grow sustainably. It's not possible to transform lives till we are not able to put women into positions of leadership. We are not able to do more financial inclusion. We are not able to improve learning outcomes and health outcomes of women. We are not able to change the whole cycle of malnutrition by ensuring that women produce healthy children who are not, very, very healthy children. Therefore, there is a need to focus on women as very major architects of growth. And therefore, women-led development is a very key priority for India. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've dwelt on the development priority, the perspective of how political narrative is important in G20. I've dwelt on what is the priorities of India. Let me dwell a little bit more on how India is doing the G20. And India's G20 is very different from what other countries do. Other countries hold G20 in one or two cities of their country. They do it in their capital. And India could have done this in Delhi, all the meetings, and they could have been very official meeting. But the Prime Minister decided that he'll use this opportunity to make this into a people's movement. He'll convert this into a Jan Andolan and use this G20 actually to take it out to every state of India. So we are doing 215 meetings in all the states and union territories of India. We're doing it in 59 cities of India. We are using this opportunity to transform every single city of India where we are taking it in terms of their drainage, sewage, solid waste, in terms of improving the quality of urban infrastructure. So when we had the Sherpa meeting in Udaipur, the Fatehpur Lake was transformed, the roads were done up. We've just finished a meeting in Kumaragam in the backwaters of Kerala, the Kerala government, which is an opposition-run state, but it's a great example of cooperative federalism. They transformed the backwaters, they built up a new convention center, which will make Kumaragam a 365 days a year destination. They brought in new houseboats, they really transformed the roads. So Kumaragam became one of the top destinations, and actually Aurangabad, Pune, all these cities have been transformed simply because of G20. So we are using this opportunity to really transform the cities. The other thing we are doing is to use this power to the G20 to push the brand entity of the states in terms of their culture. So everywhere we are doing only local state culture. How do we promote and market the state culture? How do we promote market their handloom, their handicraft, one district, one product? We are using this opportunity to push for millets in a big way. So every meal has a millet component to it. We've done everything possible to bring a unique brand entity for every single state of India. So ladies and gentlemen, my belief is that G20 is a very unique opportunity. It's an opportunity to brand, promote, market India, but more than that, it's an opportunity to drive the destiny of the world through our leader. It's an opportunity to transform the states and the cities. It's an opportunity to push for priorities which will be transformational for the world. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we are doing G20 in a very, very different manner. We are differentiating it from anything else. If you look at a world football tournament, it's held for 14 days. If you look at a cricket tournament, it's held for about 20 days. If you look at a tennis tournament, it's held for 10 days. But here, G20 is being done for a whole year, and this is an opportunity to transform India and transform India and transform these 59 cities and use this opportunity to transform the world, which we'll do to the best of our ability. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Is he asking?
Thank you very much, Mr. Kant. You give such a comprehensive overview of a complex transformational exercise that the country is going through, and there's no one more able to be the Sherpa to this dialogue. Mr. Kant, I'm going to ask a series of questions which maybe you could just answer in one go. How can we keep the focus of these G20 countries on the agenda and priorities that India lays out and not allow it to get derailed? At the same time, what would you consider to be the success of this in December this year when we do pass on the baton to the next country? What would you define as a success? And lastly, the Prime Minister has such clear vision and leadership in establishing institutions such as the International Solar Alliance. The legacy of the G20 to continue the priorities and agenda that India has put forward for future years so that they don't get disregarded. What thought has there been put to allow that legacy to take the form of an institution? So these are just some preliminary questions, Mr. Kant, to you.
Nikhil, one is that there is a geopolitical crisis. There's a war going on for over a year. And we're not a party to that war. It's a war going on between Russia and Ukraine is being supported by other countries. And there's a geopolitical crisis. So last year in Bali, we had a scenario where 17 ministerial meetings had failed. 17 ministerial meetings had failed. And then the last Sherpa meeting just before the leaders conference came in, and India played a very key role in that. And at about 12, the next day morning at about 8 o'clock, the leaders meeting was to be held. By about 12 o'clock, we were able to stitch an agreement. And how we stitched it was that our argument was that G20 is not a political body. It's an economic forum. It talks about growth and development and financial progress. But G7's argument was that the war is having a huge impact. The war is having a huge impact on food, fuel, fertilizer, and therefore it is having a huge impact on the economies of Europe because of this. And therefore, G20, the war has severe repercussions on economy. Now, after about 6 days of negotiations, we finally said that G20 will not look at the politics of it. The political body is the United Nations General Assembly, which is to discuss all political bodies. So we went back to the UN General Assembly resolution. We adopted the UN General Assembly resolution with its voting pattern, put it into that para 3, and we finally said that in para 4, we said that G20 is not a forum to discuss this, but in the view of the extraordinary situation, we are bringing in the UN General Assembly resolution into that. Now, that resolution right now, which was accepted by Russia and Bali, Russia now says that the situation is transformed on ground, and therefore in the finance ministers meeting in Bangalore and in the foreign ministers meeting in Delhi, they did not accept this. So there are deliberations going on. There are a number of ministerials. We'll see how it shapes up. But our view is that our view strongly is that we should ensure that G20 is not excessively politicized. There is a war going on. There is a repercussion on the economy. We should fall back on the resolution of the United Nations. There's a subsequent resolution of the United Nations after Bali. We should fall back on the updated resolution. That's our perspective.
Anything on what you'd consider as a success or?
Our success is to be very ambitious, as the Prime Minister said, very ambitious, inclusive, decisive, action-oriented, push for many of the priorities which I talked about. So our success should be determined against the priorities that we've laid out. We'll push for them. Our success should not be determined by whether we are on account of a war which is not a war of our making.
Thank you, Mr. Kant. We've had the opportunity to get certain slips from, we've already gotten questions actually from, on slips. I won't be able to go through all of them, but I will give you the gist of where the questions come from. And they are about how these conversations in the G20 can touch the lives of individuals. The questions about how, I think maybe taking your earlier hat from Niti Aayog as well, in terms of e-initiatives in batteries, which are more progressive, to how could these digital public goods, which are truly transformative in the nature of a development of a company, how could they translate into physical public goods, which seem to have much greater problems in terms of being able to assign accountability and responsibility? Will this transformation or this opportunity for transformation give an impetus to some of these challenges?
So Nikhil, I've been a long-term believer that there are many things which India should do irrespective of G20. I mean, India needs to grow at high rates of 9 to 10% per annum, year after year for 3 decades or more. And that would require us to, go in for sunrise areas of growth. These sunrise areas of growth are electric mobility, mobile manufacturing, advanced chemistry, cell battery, opening up your space sector. These are areas of which are going to give you huge value, green hydrogen. All these are areas. The world is transforming, and the world is transforming in these areas. It's very important that we get into these areas of growth and take leadership position, because they are the areas which are going to make a huge difference. Our population, 42% of our population is still dependent on agriculture. We need to, and they're poorly paid jobs. So we need to take them out and formalize these jobs into good urbanization, which is urbanization will again, you're going to see 500 million people getting into urbanization. And therefore, you're going to create 2 Americas in the next 5 decades. So sustainable urbanization, good water, good electricity, all these is critical. And therefore, everything is not related to G20. What the government is pushing for is that every citizen has a house, electricity, good infrastructure, roads, new cities. That's what we are aiming at, that the country grows and prospers at high rates.
Thank you very much. It's now my privilege to ask Yezdi to give us the concluding remarks to this session.
Mr Amitabh Kant, Sherpa G20, Mr Srinivas Dempo, for President AIMA, Mr Nikhil Sawhney, Vice President AIMA, Ms Rekha Sethi, Director General AIMA, and past presidents. It's always a pleasure to listen to Mr Kant talk about G20, to talk about India's development as well as its challenges. But today we've hit a new high where we had the pleasure of Mr Nikhil Sawhney adding to it as well. As Mr Kant explained and highlighted, we are in turbulent times. There is statistics of 1/3 of the world touching recession and 75 countries being impacted by financial implications. And in all of that, the fact that no country is an island, and we are living in a connected world, and we have the opportunity of G20, which extends over a year, which is longer than a lot of movies, as Mr. Kabir Bedi would know. India's train has left the station. It's galloping at a clip which is galloping in statistical terms, absorbing more than country populations with each station, whether it's Australia, whether it's Germany, in terms of digitization, in terms of transforming lives, in terms of an inclusive, resilient, and sustainable growth. There is importance of green hydrogen, as Mr. Grant brought out, but no achievement is complete without the element of digitization, where we are superlative as a country and as a population, where we have an opportunity to lead the Global South, but most importantly, where we have the opportunity to have a women-led development. While there were lots of statistics spoken about by Mr. Kant impromptu, what he did touch upon is the fact that today India is at its pinnacle of confidence to achieve what it sets out to. And that's what's very different in the new India today. On behalf of AIMA, I thank you both. Thank you.